Hello everyone, I'm Harpreet Singh, welcoming you to the Future of Work Pioneers podcast. Today, we are speaking with Professor Stuart Russell. Dr. Russell was trained at Oxford and Stanford. He's currently a member of the faculty at UC Berkeley, where he holds the Smith-Zadeh Chair in Engineering. He's also an adjunct professor of neurological surgery at UC San Francisco and vice chair of the World Economic Forum's Council on AI and Robotics. Professor Russell, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Harpreet. It's nice to be here.
So I spent one summer teaching at Oxford and found it to be a very different experience when compared to an American university. Given your training at both Oxford and Stanford, it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on the differences between the English and the American higher education. Who's doing a better job when it comes to preparing young people to become productive and well-rounded citizens?
So that's a great question. I should say I was only an undergraduate at Oxford, and so I saw it from the receiving end. And the Oxford and Cambridge systems are somewhat different from most other universities, even in the UK, because the majority of the teaching is done through tutorials. So for our American listeners, a tutorial is where a faculty member meets either one-on-one or one-on-two with undergraduates, typically once a week. And they are responsible for teaching the material of an entire course to that student or to those students. And it's a very different form of instruction. So typically in the mathematical sciences and physical sciences, there'll be a problem set each week, and you'll bring your solutions and discuss them and explain where you got stuck, and then the professor will try to get you unstuck. And if all goes well, then you'll spend the remaining 45 minutes talking about the next topic. And sometimes the professor will just say, go to the library and find out about low temperature semiconductors. And so that would be your assignment for the week, and you'd have to come back with something interesting to say. So there was very much more open-ended, self-directed learning in the English system. We had no grades, so the only grade that matters is the grade you get from your final exams at the end of 3 years or 4 years, by which time you already have a job, or you've already been admitted to or rejected from graduate school. So I would say the English system works very well for people who have a great deal of initiative and motivation, and are able to resist distractions. And I think the American system, where we give grades, we have lots of graded homework, every course matters towards your overall GPA. I think it's better suited as a natural transition from the way things are done in American high schools. I would say I did not make the best of my Oxford education. I was much more on the distracted side. So I think actually a combination would be good. I think you do need that incentive, at least every term, every semester, to get a grade. In order to get you out of bed in the morning and go to complex analysis lectures or whatever it is. So I think I would have probably done better in the American system. But my daughter has been a freshman at Berkeley and a sophomore at Oxford over the last 2 years. And she absolutely loves the Oxford system. She finds the tutorials so much more useful because, in a lecture system, you get to ask one question every 2 weeks. In a tutorial system, you get to ask 100 questions every week. And so she just learns so much faster.
So that's fascinating. And at Oxford, you get to wear your robes like at Hogwarts when you're taking your exams.
That's right. Yes, and a white bow tie to take your exam. So It's still it's a beautiful city. I used to walk every day just around the streets of Oxford, looking at the colleges and the beautiful green lawns and the ancient buildings, and I loved it.
But I guess in some ways, in the humanities in the US, we do have seminars, right? So they're kind of similar to a tutorial where you sit around a table, 10 people, and you discuss a book or you discuss a topic every week.
A little bit, yes. I mean, in the humanities tutorials in Oxford, you bring an essay every week and you read it to the professor, who then tears it to shreds. And I mean, I remember I did a PhD viva voce exam at Oxford when I was visiting, and the other professor told me, "Okay, here's the point. We grill them until we've proved that we're cleverer than they are, and then we pass them."
That's great. I want to switch to your book, Human Compatible AI and the Problem of Control. I found it to be fascinating. Can you summarize the main arguments of the book for our audience?
Sure. It's actually a pretty simple argument. So we begin with an understanding of what do we mean by artificial intelligence? How is it commonly understood? And I boiled it down to what I call the standard model, which is that we build machines whose actions can be expected to achieve their objectives. And we plug in the objectives and then off they go. And that standard model was sort of borrowed from, an ancient philosophical and economic notion of rationality in humans, that a human acts rationally when they act in such a way that can be expected to achieve their objectives or maximize their expected utility in the economic language. And so that concept was borrowed and plugged straight into AI. And not just in AI, actually, in economics, we design policies to maximize some specified objectives, such as quarterly profit or GDP or welfare. In control theory, we minimize a cost function, and in statistics, we minimize a loss function, and so on. So it's actually a pretty common model. And the problem is it doesn't work. It only works when you're sure that the objective that you're plugging into the machine is, in fact, the complete and correct description of your preferences about how the future should go. And we've known since at least the ancient Greek period, when they had the legend of King Midas, that we're not very good at specifying objectives completely and correctly. So King Midas got it completely wrong. He said, everything I touch should turn to gold, and that's what he got. And then he realized that included his food and his drink and his family. So as we're seeing already, when we build AI systems this way, they can have serious negative consequences. We look at our social media platforms, which select content for billions of people to spend hours every day reading and watching. And those algorithms that select that content are designed to optimize a simple objective like click-through, right? What's the probability that the user will click on this thing that I'm selecting for them, or engage with it or read it or whatever? And we're already seeing the consequences of that. In fact, what the algorithms are learning to do is not just to send people only the things that they're interested in, which of course we understand as the filter bubble, but to manipulate people, because by manipulating people, the algorithms can turn them into more predictable clickers, which is all they care about. And whatever consequences that has for the human race, the algorithms are totally indifferent to that, because they're maximizing click-through. And this is going to get much worse as AI systems get better and better. The outcomes for humanity get worse and worse, which is pretty much the definition of a terrible engineering methodology, right? The better your solution to the problem, the worse the outcome. So the second half of the book says we need a new model for AI. And in particular, we need a model where we are not plugging in specific objectives. And so what that actually means is that the true objective which is the satisfaction of human preferences about the future, is hidden from the machine. So that it knows that that is the objective, but it doesn't know what it means. It doesn't know what humans prefer the future to be like. And it knows that it doesn't know that. And when you design machines that way, then all of a sudden, these scenarios of the machine, turning the planet into a pile of paper clips because we said make paper clips, or, turning the oceans into sulfuric acid because we said, please restore, the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere to fix global warming. Whatever we got wrong, the machine will now behave differently. It will say, for example, I come up with a plan to fix the carbon dioxide, but it involves turning the oceans into sulfuric acid. Is that okay? Right? And it will do that because it wants to avoid messing with the part of the world about which it's uncertain as to whether we like it or not. Right? It doesn't want to change anything in the world if that change might be deleterious to humans. And in the extreme case, it would happily allow itself to be switched off because it wants to avoid doing whatever it would be that would cause us to switch it off in the first place.
Yeah, and then on a related note, you raise this question regarding human level or superhuman AI, and you ask this question: what if we do succeed in doing so, or building something like this? So, and you think this is the most important question facing humanity. So how do we think about this problem? How do we address such a problem from not happening?
So, right. So the natural extrapolation of our current technological approach to AI is that as the machines become more and more and more capable, it becomes harder and harder to interfere with the process of optimizing the objective, which is how we design our AI systems. So we specify the wrong objective, the machine is pursuing that objective, and in fact it will, if it's sufficiently intelligent, it will take steps to prevent us from interfering with whatever it is that it's pursuing. And as we realize that in fact we specified the objective wrong, it's in some sense too late. So we lose control. And some people, so Steve Omohundro in particular, have argued that for almost any objective, the natural method to optimize the probability of success by the machine is to acquire as many computational and physical resources as possible, and to take preemptive defensive steps to ward off any route by which people might interfere with the process of achieving the objective. And so you really do end up in a conflict, a chess match for the future of the world. And we know what happens when we play chess with machines. We just lose. And it's quite possible that we would see disasters of this kind on a smaller scale before it was too late. In fact, I would argue that we might be seeing one already with the social media content selection algorithms, simple as they are. But it also might be the case that we don't see it until it's too late, until we really have irreversibly lost control. So the solution that I'm proposing avoids that failure mode for AI. I think at the moment we have relatively simple theorems and relatively simple algorithmic instantiations of this new kind of AI, but in those simple models, the right thing happens, and we can actually prove that the machine will be beneficial to human beings, even though it starts out not knowing what that even means. And so I'm pretty optimistic about that. I think there are some other very difficult open problems that we face. I think the problem of misuse is very serious. We already have $1 trillion cybercrime problem, and they're just getting started. And with the availability of AI, then that would be a much more serious problem. And we call that the Dr. Evil problem. And the second one is overuse. So assuming that we have beneficial AI and assuming that people learn not to misuse it, then we may be tempted to use AI too much. We turn over more and more of the management of our civilization and the knowledge of our civilization to machines. And if you think about it, right, I did a little calculation, and it turns out that we've spent about 1 trillion person years over history teaching the next generation how to run our civilization. All the knowledge that we had accumulated so far, pass it on. Otherwise, it dies and we die. So that's a huge amount of effort, and we had no choice. But if we have a choice where we can pass it on to machines who will do everything for us, then perhaps we won't make the effort anymore. And that story you can see in E.M. Forster has a story from 1909 called "The Machine Stops," which I highly recommend. One of the earliest forecasts of the internet, iPads, video conferencing, MOOCs, the reluctance to have face-to-face contact with other human beings, and computer-induced obesity are all there in that story in 1909. But in that story, people have become completely dependent on the machines with predictably bad consequences.
Well, I've definitely read E.M. Forster's A Passage to India. I didn't know he wrote about machines as well.
That's right. Yes, it was usually costume dramas, but he did write science fiction.
That's great. So you touched a little bit about the history, and you also have talked about AI bubbles that burst. So can you, for the benefit of the audience, just touch upon that, explain what are these bubbles and what are the historical antecedents?
So a bubble comes about when claims are made or expectations arise about the capabilities of AI systems that are not fulfilled by the actual systems that we can produce. So I think in the early mid-60s, there was a great deal of excitement. We had some quite interesting ideas about machine learning, about machine reasoning, translation of languages, and actually some moderate degree of success. So I think probably the most impressive was Arthur Samuel's checker playing program, which taught itself to play checkers to a quite good level, strong amateur level, better than 95% of human beings, and was demonstrated on television in 1956. And you can imagine that caused a huge amount of excitement. And I think people then believed that if you could have a program that learned to do something that's difficult and complicated, that really taxes the mind of human beings, and it could do that entirely by itself, then we were on the brink of superhuman machines. And many AI professors made that kind of prediction. But the technology turned out to be very limited. And in the late 60s, several well-funded projects basically ground to a halt without any success. Machine translation being one of them. And that led to the first massive cutback in funding. It wasn't called an AI winter in those days because the phrase nuclear winter hadn't yet come into common parlance. That was around 1980. But we now call it the first AI winter. And in the UK, AI was in some sense officially banned after the Lighthill report. The government basically forbade the funding agencies from funding AI at anywhere other than Edinburgh and Sussex. And the second big explosion of interest in AI came in the mid-80s with what we call expert systems. And the idea was that there's a tremendous amount of knowledge work in the economy. expertise being used to do all kinds of things, from medical diagnosis to designing oil rigs. And if you could capture the expert knowledge and replicate it in a machine and have that machine do the same kind of reasoning and judgment and problem solving, that could have a huge economic impact. And there were some early successes again, and people over extrapolated from those early successes. And they believed that we could, automate 60% of the entire economy or whatever. And this just turned out not to be the case for several reasons. One of which was that the technology for combining evidence when there is uncertainty about the problem, which is, for example, very common in medical diagnosis. There's almost always uncertainty about what the real problem is with the patient. But the technology was simply inadequate for reasoning under uncertainty. And as people built larger and larger systems, they became more and more fragile. So you'd add another rule, and then the first lot of rules would stop working properly, or there'd be interactions among the rules that caused bad results. And company after company after company found that it was much harder to build working systems than they thought, much harder to integrate those systems into their business and workflow. And so there was a real AI winter in the late 80s. And I remember by about 1990, my AI course was down to 25 students. And is now around 1,000 students. So we are certainly in the middle of another big explosion of interest right now. And we don't yet know if that bubble is going to burst. We'll see.
So, I remember taking Lisp as an undergrad in the 90s. And so today, languages are much more accessible, right? So everyone is learning Python. So you think that explosion in number of students taking, AI courses is because of the ease with which you can code certain algorithms, or the libraries that are available?
I think that helps a little bit, but I think it's much more to do with the capabilities that AI systems have exhibited. So what's happened since the beginning of the decade, around 2011, we saw very rapid advances on real problems, beginning with speech and then visual object recognition and machine translation, using deep learning technology, which had been around actually for more than 15 years at that point. But a combination of various things, more data, bigger machines, so that mainly so that you could experiment more quickly. I think that was the impact of having access to faster machines, and then various small algorithmic improvements. How we train those networks, the algorithms we use to tweak all the parameters of the networks were improved slightly. The details of the elements of the networks were slightly modified, and that turned out to make things a bit easier. So the way I often describe it is that we had a Ferrari back in the mid-90s, but we were driving around in first gear, not realizing that if you just put it into fourth gear, you could go 200 miles an hour. And so that happened. We went into fourth, fifth, sixth gear sometime around 2011. And the range of applications now for machine learning technology is really pretty remarkable. And I think there are tens of thousands of real revenue generating applications out there, not just of deep learning, but the fact that those successes happened meant that companies were willing to try all the AI techniques that had been developed over the last 70 years. And they had data available, which made it much easier to try them. So now I think we will see, even if there are no further basic advances in the technology, we'll see another decade of rollout of all these ideas in all the different application contexts.
This episode is brought to you by Experfy. Incubated in Harvard Innovation Lab, Experfy provides custom future of work solutions, such as private talent clouds and skill taxonomies. Experfy differentiates itself by using subject matter experts to pre-vet and pipeline candidates for AI and high-end technology skills. However, Experfy Talent Cloud Platform is skill agnostic and can be licensed to build custom talent clouds for any and all skills. In a different use case, enterprises interested in employee intermobility can license the Experfy platform to create an internal gigs marketplace where interested employees can be algorithmically matched to projects, gamifying their learning experience. Visit www.experfy.com for more information.
In this context, what are the things that you think are most exciting in your view when we think about the range of applications, right? You got self-driving cars, you've got smart homes and robots and smart cities, personal assistants that are showing up. So where do you think groundbreaking developments are happening that can really be beneficial?
I think in the next decade, so if you said the last decade, the biggest change was in vision. And I would say that the problem of recognizing objects and tracking objects in video and so on is largely solved. Still not perfect, but it's pretty good. I think this decade will be the decade of language. And at the moment, the systems are superficial. They're able to perform well on various sort of benchmark tests. But I think even the aficionados of those approaches would say, yeah, it's not really extracting factual content from text. It's not able to combine factual information from one document with factual information from another document and draw conclusions. So it's not really understanding the text. Even at a factual level, let alone an emotional level or whatever else it might be. So, but I think that problem actually is solvable, and the economic value is enormous. I mean, if you think about the value that search engines have created, so just the market cap is more than $1 trillion for search engines. But Eric Brynjolfsson and some of his colleagues did some studies, and this is one of the questions about, where's all the missing GDP, right? We have all these amazing technological advances, but GDP is still not growing very fast. And he wondered whether that was because we're generating enormous value and giving it away, right? So we don't pay for search engines. So he asked people, how much would you have to be paid to give up using internet search engines for a year? And for Americans, I think the average was $17,000. So if you just take that, multiply it by the number of Americans, it comes to, I think that's something like 10 trillion or something like that. So it's an enormous amount of value that's being generated simply by keyword search and indexing based on keywords. So if you had search engines that actually understood all those web pages that they've been indexing, they could read all of them. They could understand not necessarily everything the human race has ever written. I mean, I don't understand James Joyce, so I don't know how the machines would, but most of it, right? So all the factual stuff, all the scientific textbooks, and so on, and read it, understood it, integrated it into a whole, going back to documents from the Babylonian period, and so on. It would be a truly amazing resource for humanity. And we can't really imagine all the things that we would do with it, but we couldn't really imagine all the things we would do with search engines either. And so I think that would be such a wonderful thing for humanity. And I'm fairly optimistic that it's going to happen in this decade.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, this the voice is really changing the AI landscape. So I wanted to ask you about the computer vision, since you mentioned that was where we saw the most growth in the last decade. So there's this debate that's happening in the commercial space where Tesla is trying to avoid using Lidar for self-driving, whereas you've got companies like Waymo and Google that are betting on Lidar.
Mhm.
Do you see one approach being more successful than the other?
So I think there are interesting practical reasons why Tesla took this, because Lidar back in 2012 or so was really quite expensive. So they did not design all their cars with built-in Lidar. And so they have no way to do over-the-air software updates to make their cars self-driving with Lidar. So they have to bet on cameras. And my sense is that at the moment, cameras cannot quite deliver the required accuracy. I mean, the accident where the Tesla plowed straight into the side of an enormous white truck tells you that the vision algorithms are not good enough. And having multiple sensory modalities means that, in situations where vision fails, perhaps the Lidar will succeed, and where the Lidar fails, perhaps the vision will succeed. So it gives you another 9 of reliability. And I always say you need about 8 nines of reliability to drive successfully, and we're probably somewhere at 4 or 5 nines, and so this will get you to 6 nines, so that's good. We still have a way to go, and I think besides perception, the other 2 nines I think have to come from having a much better, what we would think of as a common sense understanding of the driving situation, because those last 2 nines are things that happen once every few months, right? And you can't afford to die once every few months. So in these situations where once every few months some weird stuff happens, there's a flock of goats crossing the road, as happened in San Jose yesterday. You have to understand what's going on, right? You have to understand that these are solid obstacles that you can't drive into. That they are going to move out the way eventually, unlike, if there's a big broken down truck in the middle of a 1-lane country road, then it's not going to move out of the way, and you should probably reverse all the way down the road and take a different route. And those kinds of things, for most of the self-driving car companies, are out of reach, because the way they've approached the problem is that they are doing end-to-end either supervised learning or reinforcement learning in simulation. And they don't understand, first of all, what's the purpose of driving, right? It's not built, there's no explicit representation that you want to get somewhere and you don't want to kill people, right? Neither of those things is built in, right? If the reason the car stops when there's a human being in front is because it's just a built-in rule. When there's a human being in front, you have to stop. Just like there is when there's a red light. When there's a red light in front, you have to stop. It doesn't know the difference. It doesn't know why you have to stop. And so when it's in a situation that's unfamiliar, it has nothing to fall back on. Whereas, we've always built chess programs to deal with the unexpected, right? The chess program knows that it's trying to win the game. And it knows what happens if it does this and the opponent does that, and it does this and the opponent does that. So it can look ahead and decide which is the most desirable course of action based on its understanding of the objective. And Waymo, that's the way they are building their self-driving cars. And I think that approach is now working its way into the various other projects, into Uber, and probably eventually into Tesla. Because I think it's the only way to go.
Yeah, that's a very interesting space. I think Tesla last week turned on stopping at stop signs and red lights. So they're making progress little by little, I guess. So switching gears to, you have an important role on the World Economic Forum Committee for AI and Robotics. So what are you seeing from the perspective of future of work? What are the current debates that are going on?
So it's a great question. And so on the council, we have a mix. There are very few AI people, surprisingly, on the Global AI Council. So mostly government ministers and CEO or equivalents. And so the policy question, I would say, that's most engaging for government ministers, except for how can we cure COVID, is how is AI going to impact our economies, and in particular, the employment opportunities for people. And when you look at AI stories in the media, lots of people click on things with Terminators and killer robots and whatever, but the ones that they share with their friends and family are stories about employment. And that really says that people are very concerned about the prospects for their jobs. And interestingly, self-driving trucks have been pointed to as one of the first big areas of employment that may go away. And already trucking companies are having a really hard time hiring new truck drivers because the new truck drivers don't believe that job is going to exist for very long. So counterintuitively, salaries for truck drivers are going up and up as a result. So the Forum's AI Council has created a workshop series. We were going to have our first workshop April 23rd. We ended up holding it online instead. And the basic idea of the premise that we put to the council was that at the moment, economists are very much aware of this problem. In fact, I've seen several Nobel laureates say this is the biggest problem facing the world economy. But economists are not in the business of designing completely new economic structures. They're not the people who imagine different futures. They could analyze one if you gave it to them. On the other hand, the science fiction writers are in the business of imagining different futures, different ways you could organize the world. But they don't have the economic training to say whether that makes sense economically and whether it would hold together. So roughly we said we're going to put the economists and science fiction writers in the same room and not let them out until they came up with a future that you would want your children to live in. And unfortunately, we couldn't put them in the same room. So we couldn't sort of lock them down, right? They were just sitting at home on a Zoom conference. But we made a start. And I think economists are actually pleasantly open to new ideas that might come from outside the discipline. I think they're aware that they're more of an analytic than a synthetic discipline. So the big issue is simply that as AI progresses, more and more tasks that people do for money will be done more cheaply and better by machines. And so in some cases, like driving trucks, almost the entire job is automated away. In other cases, for example, a lot of the people who work for accounting firms, they just process piles and piles of paper, invoices, reconciling payments and invoices and that kind of thing. And a lot of those tasks are already being automated. There's a whole field called RPA, robot process automation, and a lot of the outsourcing jobs that have boosted economies in developing countries are being automated precisely because in order to be outsourced, they have to be parcelable. Right? We have to be able to, and then we can send 20 million of these parcels and then get back the results. And that's sort of ripe for automation because it's repetitive and context-free, right? That it's a task that can be done without understanding a large context. So if we see 40, 50, 60% of current jobs going away, which some economists think is quite plausible, then there are going to be real difficulties. And I think eventually you'd have to say, all routine physical and mental work will be done better, more cheaply by machines. So I think there are some professions currently that are fairly immune, but not necessarily the white collar ones. Many of the white collar ones are, in a sense, routine mental work. So radiologists are already quite nervous. What happens, right? Do we end up with an economy where there's a thin layer of the owners of the AI, and then a thin layer of their personal servants, and then everyone else is fed and housed and entertained by machines, but that's it? Is that the world that we're aiming for? And this is the vision that some UBI, the Universal Basic Income enthusiasts, are actually aiming for, that we would all just be given a stipend for being human, and that would be that. I think this is a terrible failure. I think to say that the vast majority of humans have no useful function in society is unacceptable. And we have to ask, what are humans? What are humans going to be able to do? What is the shape of an economy that you would want your children to grow up in when machines are doing most of what we currently think of as work? So that was the question for the workshop. And my own view is that we're going to have a very, very different economy, that what most people are going to be doing is in the nature of person-to-person individual services. And when you think about those kinds of professions right now, there's a wide range, right? It goes, at the high end in terms of income and prestige, you have psychiatrists, executive coaches. At the low end, you have childcare, elder care. But there are many more needs than that. And I think it's quite likely in the future that we will have enormous needs for individual tutoring, and I think Keynes had a very nice phrase for it. Those who are skilled in the art of life will be able to enjoy the fruits of technology, or something like that. But we need to become skilled in the art of life, and that's a complicated and very individualized process. So here's the problem with that idea, right? It sounds very nice, but the problem is, at the moment, many of these professions are low paid and low skilled because we simply lack the knowledge of how to do them better. So let's take childcare, right? Our children are our most precious possessions. But we pay a bored teenager $5 an hour and everything they can eat from the fridge to look after our children for 6 hours while we're away doing something, right? Well, why is that? Because we don't know any better, right? We don't know how to care for children in a highly beneficial way. I'm sure many babysitters are literally harmful to our children. I know my babysitter tried to teach me to smoke. So you have a problem, and when you have a broken leg, you don't pay a bored teenager $5 an hour and everything they can eat from the fridge to fix your leg, right? In the US, your orthopedic surgeon is making $6,000 an hour for surgery. So what that seems to mean is that we need to catch up on the science and engineering of humanity. Right? We've done a lot of science and engineering of material goods. So here's my cell phone, right? We spent $1 trillion of R&D to get this far, right? And has it really helped the human race? Well, a bit. But we, in comparison, have very little understanding of the psychological sciences of education and so on. And I think those are going to grow in importance. So when government ministers ask, what should we do? How should we invest more in STEM education? I say, well, in the short term, yes, but in the long term, that's the wrong direction. At least STEM in the sense of producing physical objects, whether it's cell phones or networks or self-driving cars or whatever, that's not what we need, right? In 20 or 30 years, we need to be able to have generations of people who are extremely skilled in these human sciences in order that they can function successfully in the economy and add value. If they're not adding value, then they won't receive value, right? They won't have status and prestige and job satisfaction, and everyone's standard of living will suffer. So this takes a long time. I think 20 years is optimistic to say that we could generate whole new scientific fields and then create educational curricula in those fields and then train a whole generation of practitioners and then create new professions and credentials and all those things. It takes decades and decades and decades to do this. So my recommendation is we have to start now on doing this and think about how it's going to work.
That's fascinating. And, very interestingly, the current administration in Washington is phasing out the National Endowment of Humanities. There, a lot of the funding, if you look at 100 years ago, universities, what the funding they used to receive for the humanities kind of really been reduced to almost nothing. So it's fascinating that, you're providing as someone coming from an engineering discipline, providing this perspective that it's very good.
Well, I'm not necessarily saying we should just spend more on doing the same kinds of humanities, because I think in some ways some parts of the humanities have dug their own grave by becoming by having an entirely introverted agenda. They don't see themselves as having a benefit for humanity. It's more like a benefit for their own school of thought in defeating some other school of thought within their own discipline. So I think that the focus of research in those areas would need to be very different if we're to bring about these kinds of changes.
Yes. So Professor Russell, any parting words for our audience?
So my feeling is that the next 50 years will have a bigger effect on the human race than the last 5,000 years. And so it's a very exciting time, but we need everyone to pitch in and help make sure that the next 50 years go in the right direction and not the wrong direction.
Thank you. That's a great place to end. It's been an enlightening conversation.
Thank you, Harpreet. Very nice talking to you.